So on the one hand, we have this reality of calories in versus calories burned. However, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention an incredible study that was done by my colleague, Aliyah Crum at Stanford. She's a faculty member, a professor in the psychology department, looking at how belief effects, just thinking, can impact the effects of things like exercise on weight loss. These are just incredible results. What they did was they took subjects who were hotel service people that would clean the hotels and come in and change the linens and so forth, divide them into two groups. One group, they were told, moving around and doing your duties for your job, meet the standards for U.S. guidelines for activity and movement, et cetera, and a basic lecture about how movement is good for you, et cetera, but mostly just that their daily activities met the standards for the U.S. The other group, however, was given a bunch of information about how movement and their daily routine was very good for cardiovascular health. It could be good for weight loss, et cetera. And then they tracked these subjects over a period of many weeks. The take-home message from this study was that simply being told that movement is good for you, can lead to weight loss, et cetera, led to significantly more body fat loss, waist to hip ratio changes in the direction that most people would want, essentially a slimming down, if you will, and all sorts of other positive effects on things like cardiovascular health, simply by the knowledge that movement and exercise can help various health markers. So this is remarkable, and it speaks to the power of the nervous system and the power of belief in governing aspects of our body and our physiology that one would otherwise think were outside our conscious control. Now, of course, any of you that think scientifically, which I imagine if you watch this podcast or listen to this podcast is all of you by now, probably thinking, well, maybe they just moved around more, or maybe they stood up and sat down more. Maybe they did something else that was different. And indeed, there's a strong possibility that they did things differently than the other group. But the mere knowledge that exercise is good for you, that movement is good for you, shifted their behavior and their physiology in the direction of enhanced weight loss, fat loss, et cetera. So how we think about a given set of activities affects how we perform those activities, and how we think and about and perform those activities has a real effect on our physiology. So somewhere between the hard and fast rule that governs fat loss and weight loss, which is if you ingest more calories than you burn, you'll either maintain or gain weight. Typically, you'll gain weight, although not always. If you ingest about as many calories as you burn, you'll maintain weight, typically. And if you ingest fewer calories than you burn, typically you'll lose weight. That's the kind of rule of fat loss. And yet we also have these belief effects which show, and this has been replicated again and again, that how we think about a process, whether or not we think it's beneficial, can change our physiology in ways that can be beneficial to us. Somewhere in between those two extremes of hardcore metabolic science and belief effects lie a bunch of protocols that are grounded in quality peer-reviewed science and in physiology that you can leverage to increase the rates of fat loss. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I love this topic, and it's not that I'm so obsessed with fat loss, but rather the first project I ever worked on in science was thermogenesis and fat loss. I joined a laboratory as an undergraduate, and the guy I worked for loved to explore new compounds and how they impacted thermogenesis. And so we looked at how things like MDMA, ecstasy, how antipsychotics, antidepressants, various weight loss drugs that were on the market, how those impacted body temperature and fat loss and metabolism. And we just had so much fun doing it. So if you detect a smile on my face, that's what that's about. And I also learned a lot, and I also came to really appreciate that this tissue of our bodies, adipose tissue and fat, we think of as just this unfortunate thing, this like we're told it's a core energy source if we ever entered a famine, and that's all true, et cetera. We come to realize that these cells in our body, they are there as fuel for the furnace of our body, which is our metabolism. And there's a third player, And that's where it really gets interesting, that the nervous system, neurons, has the opportunity to turn up the intensity of that furnace. It has the opportunity to increase the amount of heat that we produce and therefore the amount of energy that we burn. And I was also really intrigued by something, which is that growing up, I think we all know people who can eat a ton and never seem to gain any body fat, or people who seem to eat very little and seem to gain body fat very easily. And I was always intrigued by that. And it turns out there are a number of different factors that relate to that, but the nervous system is the one that we can really control, both through behaviors and what we eat, but also in terms of this thing that we call thermogenesis. There was one particular story I want to relate to you that does not suggest any protocol. In fact, I'm going to discourage you from following this protocol. Please do not try the compound that I'm about to describe. One of the favorite things that we like to do in that lab was to find rare compounds and test them. And at the time, I was reading about thermogenesis, and I learned about a compound that was actually discovered in the armory factories of World War II. And it was discovered because women in particular who were working in these factories would take a brush and dip it in a compound or a paint rather, and they would then paint the numbers with a stencil onto things like bombs and ammunition of various kinds. And they were losing weight like crazy. And it turns out that occasionally they'd lick the brush and then they would go back just to get a sharper point on the brush. And then they would paint onto these various bullets and missiles and so forth, bombs and so forth. And they started shedding all their body fat. And many of them lost a lot of weight, a significant portion of their weight, without changing anything else that they were doing, what they were eating, etc. Turned out that compound is something called dinitrophenol, DNP. And over the years, dinitrophenol, DNP, has gained popularity in some niche cultures, mainly bodybuilders, athletes, even in the kind of modeling industry. It is a absolutely terrible compound for anyone to use because it's highly fatal if your body temperature goes too high. Hyperthermia will kill you. And indeed, many people have died using dinitrophenol as a weight loss drug or attempting to use it as a weight loss drug. But dinitrophenol really illustrates a principle, which is that your metabolism includes things like thyroid hormone and growth hormone, etc. But your body temperature and the way you utilize energy is controlled by your nervous system. And the way dinitrophenol works is by changing the neurons and the way that the neurons that connect to fat change the way fat burns up. So we are not going to suggest, I am not suggesting that you use dinitrophenol. However, there are other things that you can do that can change the relationship between these neurons and the fat of your body in ways that can powerfully accelerate fat loss. And I don't know why we don't hear about these things more, but probably because most of what you see out there on the internet focuses more on what you could eat and should eat or shouldn't eat. It concentrates on exercise regimens, which we will also talk about. But the burn factor, your thermogenic environment, is one of the, if not the most important factors in this business of fat loss. And since I'm a neuroscientist, that's what we're going to talk about. So let's talk about fat utilization. Let's talk about how fat is converted into energy, which is sometimes also called fat burning. What I'd like you to know is that this is a two-part process. Okay? In reality, there are many biochemical steps. And if you log onto the internet or you open up a textbook and you want to learn about fat utilization, you're going to see a lot of chemistry. And I'm happy to go deep into that chemistry if you like, but I think most of you are probably interested in what are the leverage points? Where can you exert control over this process in ways that benefit you? So I'm going to focus mainly on those, okay? This is not to upset the aficionados, and I will put in some nomenclature, but here we go. There's two parts to this process. One is fat mobilization, and the second is fat oxidation or utilization, okay? So the first thing that has to happen for body fat to get burned up or used and reduced is that it has to get mobilized. And that's a process called lipolysis. But I actually don't care if you know the name lipolysis. You just have to move that fat out of the position that it's in. You have to get it out of the fat cells. All right. Fat cells can be visceral around our viscera, our organs, or they can be subcutaneous under our skin. Most people are thinking about subcutaneous fat when they think about fat. So here's the deal. And if you want more detail, great. I'll touch on that in a bit. But basically, stored fat has two parts that are relevant here. It's got the fatty acid part, and that's the part that your body can use. And that's attached to something called glycerol, and they're linked by a backbone. So already probably too much chemistry for both of you. But what you want is you want to break the backbone. So if you just can remember to mobilize fat, you got to break the backbone between glycerol and these fatty acids. Okay? That's accomplished by an enzyme called lipase. But you can forget all that if you want. Remember, we're just trying to mobilize fat. So the first step is to get those fatty acids moving around in the bloodstream, to get them out of those fat cells. And then they can travel and be used for energy. And that second part, remember, first part is mobilization. The second part is oxidation, is then those fatty acids, those are potential fuel. They're just potential fuel, but you haven't burned the fat yet. You've just moved it out of your fat cells. They're going to go into cells that can use them for energy. And once they are inside those cells, they're still not burned up. You need to oxidize them. You think oxidation is the burn up part. They need to be moved into the mitochondria. And then they can be converted into ATP, into energy. So just to really zoom out again to make sure I don't lose anybody, you got to mobilize the fat, then you have to oxidize the fat. You have to, in other words, you have to mobilize it, then you actually have to convert it into energy. If you just mobilize it and you don't convert it into energy, you don't oxidize it, it can be returned to body fat. And many of the things that the nervous system can do is to increase the mobilization of fat, but also the oxidation of fat. Okay, so you have two opportunities to burn more fat. And both of those opportunities are governed by your nervous system, by neurons that literally send little wires that we call axons into fat and release chemicals that provide a stimulus for more of that fat to be mobilized, and then later for more of that fat to be burned up. Okay, so we could go really deep on this, but I'm not going to go much deeper than that because this isn't a biochemistry of fatty acid metabolism lecture. This is about how to burn fat using your nervous system. But remember, there's a mobilization step and then there's an oxidation step. I think any one of you, all of you should be able to internalize that. Mobilize, then oxidize. Okay? Mobilize, then oxidize.